Today's class is number 4 in our series about France, kindly sponsored by the Federation of Alliance Française USA. They promote French language and culture through their more than 100 Alliance Française chapters across the United States. Their website is afusa.org. Why not learn some French with them today? Today, we're lucky to have members of Alliance Française chapters in, I hope I get them all, Boston, Chicago, Dallas, DuPage County, Hartford, Hawaii, Memphis, New Haven, the North Shore of Illinois, Phoenix, Portland, Raleigh-Durham, San Francisco, and Tulsa. Welcome, everyone, and please come back. It is my pleasure to introduce our guest today, who is the great Alan Riding. Alan doesn't like it when I say this, but I read his landmark book about Mexico when I was in college. It's called Distant Neighbors. It was an incredible read, and I was honored to meet him when I moved to Paris, where he's lived for many years. Alan was actually born in Brazil. He lived there until he was 11. He speaks perfect Carioca Portuguese. He was Brazil bureau chief for the New York Times, then he was their Paris bureau chief, and then it's European cultural correspondent. Alan has, I can vouch for this, a ravenous interest in culture and a profound curiosity about other people. He's very involved also with the La Korsa charity that operates in Senegal. All I can say is that when I walk into a party and I see Alan across the room, I think, okay, it's gonna be okay. We're lucky to have you here today, Alan, at Pandemonium Youth. Thank you very much for being here.
And thank you, Pamela, for that totally hyperbolic introduction. Thank you.
Not at all, not at all. Alan, I'll just start off with a general question. Tell us about Paris just before World War II as a kind of cultural center. Why was it such a hub for everything happening in the arts?
Well, the truth is that Paris was a cultural center from the 19th century, and dramatically so between the two wars. Obviously, you'd had, all the Americans wanted to come and buy Impressionists before the First World War, and then modernism arrived after the First World War. And so that drew artists from all over the place. You had the French artists, of course, you had Picasso here, Matisse, Duchamp, all of those people, the French surrealists, but then it was also drawing artists from Austria, Germany, Italy, all of those above all who felt they had to flee. And of course, when Germany fell into the hands of the Nazis, then more and more artists and intellectuals. We had writers, you had the lost generation, the Hemingways of that, Ezra Pounds, the famous Gertrude Stein. James Joyce wrote Ulysses right here, just down the road from my office, actually.
But why Paris? Why was Paris so important?
Paris was a place that represented a level of freedom for artists. And I think, if you think of why Josephine Baker, the great American black dancer, came here, she felt free. If you think of even after the war, all the American, African-American artists who came to France, particularly writers, they felt free. They felt free sexually, they felt free racially. And this was very important. And also, of course, a lot of these people were refugees. You think of the ballets russes they came before the Russian Revolution, but they were free here, Stravinsky, Diaghilev, and so on. So this was a place where you actually came, impoverished very often, but it's also a way you made where you made your name. If you want to become a well-known artist, Paris was the place. It had dealers, it had galleries, and it had the great museums, of course. And so all of this was very exciting, except for the fact that France itself was in a dreadful mess, particularly in the 30s, where the Third Republic was just old politicians. People talk about the Third Republic looking like many countries today, where politicians were going round in circles and arguing. And the students, the universities, the artists, the intellectuals were looking for utopia. And they variously found utopia in Moscow and communism, or in Berlin with Nazism. And so a vast part of the country, the thinking part of the country, was totally divided on the eve of the Second World War. And when France and Britain declared war on Germany in September 1939, after the German invasion of Poland, obviously the foreigners began to leave immediately, and the French continued arguing among themselves as to whether they could stop this or not stop this. The French governments had been late in arming themselves, but they were persuaded that they had the strongest land army in Europe.
Alan,
So,
we have a picture here, maybe I can share it now, of the way the
well,
Louvre
in the
was
countdown,
preparing itself.
we had what was known after September 39, we had what was the phony war, which was we were all expecting war, but it wasn't happening. And then it really began to look like it was going to happen. And so in the Louvre, they cleared out all of the paintings, not all of the statues, but all of the paintings, and they were distributed around mainly chateaus around France. And
In
so
the
it
Loire
did
Valley, right? They took
in
out
the Loire
something like
Valley, but also
3,600
beyond. I mean,
paintings.
the Mona Lisa, in fact, was in about 5 different places. And in fact, she finished she finished up under the bed of a curator somewhere in the south of France in some little pension. So the feeling was that one had to be she had to be looked after. So the sense of at that point, you see, people didn't really think Paris was going to fall. And when Hitler's army did in 6 weeks what seemed impossible, the collapse of the French army, the collapse of the British army, the isolation, the evacuation from Dunkirk, and the fall of Paris, which was, they didn't fight to protect Paris. It was saved in that sense, fortunately, you could say, on the 14th of June. So at that point, of course, already from Belgium, Holland, northern France, people were fleeing. And you know, the pictures that we see of the Exodus, that's one of the most famous pictures of Exodus, but it's very typical. Alas, today you see so many pictures like that of refugees around the world. In this case, a vast population, I mean, 2/3 of Parisians for a start, they left, but also all the people from the north. And Paris was just empty pretty well. When Hitler came here for the first time on the 23rd of June, just the 9 days after it fell, he drove around and it was completely empty. It was a bit like we had during the confinement here. You'd been driving around. So the notion was that it was there for the taking and the Germans took it. Now, before we get into exactly what the artists were doing, it's worth remembering that 2/5 of France was occupied, was governed by the Vichy regime. Now, Vichy is a town in southeast France where what was remained of the French government went there, and they elected Marshal Pétain as head of state. So he was the collaborationist person who was there looking after, supposedly looking after the non-occupied area. In general, though, the notion was that the Germans, Vichy, and the artists themselves wanted life to return to normal. Obviously, Jewish artists, if they could, fled, or if they couldn't leave the country, they went down to hide in the south. A few of them stayed in Paris, still believing they could continue to work. But the notion of Goebbels was, let's make Paris appear as normal as possible. And that meant opening the theaters, opening the cinemas, getting back the Comédie Française, getting the Opera Paris, and getting the nightclubs going again. And of course, you will see a lot of German officers sitting in the front row there. Usually, I have to say that the photographs of them, the ladies are rather more dressed up than they usually are when the Germans went, which was obviously part of the entertainment. In fact, Paris was such a joy. It was like the R&R, the rest and recreation for people who were fighting later in other parts of Europe, and they would be
But Ellen,
rewarded.
if so many people had left Paris, how could it feel like life was normal?
Because, well, no, people began from about August, September, people began to return. They were told they could return, and they wanted to see if their house was still there, their flat was still occupied. And the artists began to return, except for those who felt that they didn't want to have anything to do with it. You see, you had the collaborationist artists, those were right-wing, pro-Nazi artists and writers and intellectuals. They actually thought this was a pretty good thing. They thought that the Third Republic was so rotten that the French society had been completely rotten by communists, by Jews, by Freemasons, and now it would be cleaned up and France would be part of a new Europe. And so they were very persuaded by all this. A lot of the communists had to keep a low profile because Hitler and Stalin had made a deal in August 1939. And so the communists were somehow tied up. I'm talking about writers and intellectuals. They said, well, what do we do? And then you had the moderate people who at first thought that Pétain might actually be able to protect them in some way other than protect France, and gradually turned against it. And the crucial part in terms of what I found interesting in doing all this research was when the communists, and shall we say the non-communists, but moderates, who normally hate each other, because there's nothing like the hatred between the communists and some other leftists who are non-communists, but they actually began to work together and to cooperate in what became known as the cultural resistance. This was, of course, the one time that Pétain and Hitler met in October 1940. Hitler had gone down to the Spanish border to meet Franco, who he hoped would actually join the Allies. In fact, Franco remained neutral, although neutral ma non troppo, as they say. His sympathies were clearly there, but he did not join the Axis. But on the way back from there, Hitler and Pétain met. And as a result of that, Pétain made a speech and made it very clear that we have opted for collaboration. He used that word. And at that time, you know, when you talk about, oh, have you met my collaborator, it was only a bit later that the word collaborator or collaboration took on this poisonous notion that it has today.
Alan, can you tell us a bit about the American Varian Frey, because he was a very important figure in the cultural life?
Well, he wasn't, what happened was when people fled south, you had a lot of people who were refugees from Eastern Europe, but also a lot of French people who didn't want to be, to stay in France. Now, Varian Frey was a journalist, Harvard educated, for those of you who went to Harvard, and was a journalist in New York, and he finished up volunteering actually on behalf of an outfit called the Emergency Rescue Committee to go to Marseille and he was given a list of 200 famous names of all the people that were stuck there and would be the crème de la crème of artists, of European artists and intellectuals who would enrich the United States. This is a very good idea. Turned out that it wasn't entirely practical because a lot of the American government in general, despite being FDR and Eleanor Roosevelt, was actually putting all sorts of obstacles in the way of immigration, particularly of any Jews, however famous they were. But you will recall, just to throw forward, that the Americans were much more effective in importing Nazis, scientists. But so it just shows that Nazi scientists were more popular than anti-Nazi intellectuals. So Varian Frey set up this committee there, and he began trying to get people out. And he did get a lot of famous names out. I mean, he got Chagall and Levi-Strauss and Hannah Arendt and Alma Mahler. It's a really impressive list of people he managed to get out, either by boat.
About 2,000 people out of.
Well, at first, you know, he was concentrating on the famous names because that was his job, bring his famous names. But then
Frey was the one on the bottom right in that picture. Sorry, we forgot to mention that.
Yes. Actually, are your talents to flick back to that picture just very quickly? In the end, he saw there were so many people who needed help that in fact they got more than 2,000 people out. Now on the right there is, with the glasses looking serious, is Varian Frey. Behind him, looking upwards with all the hair, good hair, is André Breton. Next to him, a bit balding, is André Masson, another artist. That's Breton's wife, Jacqueline, and you get the nose of Max Ernst. So you can see that the surrealists were very concentrated there, but there were also people from all over Europe who were in fact being saved by him. Walter Benjamin also went through there, but unfortunately he got persuaded himself somehow that he was going to be returned to the Nazis. And just on the other side of the border into Spain, he committed suicide in 1940. But it was very, very important what Varian Frey did, particularly since the people who were most opposed to what he was doing were the Americans, not the Germans, not Vichy, but actually the American Consul General in Marseille. The main activity, of course, is in Paris. Now, artists and intellectuals, essentially, like most French, have the choice of collaborating. Relatively few do. Obviously, those who collaborate in the world of culture are people with some clout, writers and journalists. You can join the resistance, very little resistance until after Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, and then the communists were free to act, or you floated in the middle, hoping that somehow things would get better. Now, the floating in the middle is, shall we say, most performers, shall we say, performers who are not, who need to work. They're not wealthy enough. If you're a dancer, if you're a violinist, and you get a call from the Paris Opera or the Opéra Comique saying, listen, rehearsals start a week on Thursday, are you coming? You went. And when you finally put on that new performance of some ballet and you see a lot of Germans in the audience, well, that's the way it is. Now, is that collaboration or just having a job? This is why the lines of collaboration and resistance after a while become very blurred. Now we have, for example, this picture. The Germans, we'll look at different art forms for a second. Music is interesting because obviously the Germans, with their great musical tradition, wanted to export, to show that they were the best, and to export their music and their talent to France. And they did it.
This is a performance on the steps of the Paris Opera.
Well, this is, you know, you would have these groups traveling around, and this is obviously a choir. You can see the instrument to the right there, a choir, and those are German soldiers. But they would put on lots of performances around the country. They would, those of you who know the Luxembourg Gardens, the bandstand in the summer, they would perform there, and people loved it. And more importantly, for classical music, the great orchestras and great conductors of Germany were sent over. The Berlin Philharmonic, the Berlin Staatsoper, with Herbert von Karajan, he brought over a performance of Tristan and Isolde. And von Karajan, as you may or may not know, was a great figure after the war. And people chose to forget that he'd actually been a member of the Communist Party. Now, French musicians
the
also...
Germans thought that the one cultural area where they clearly excelled was in classical music, so they wanted to sort of lord that over the French.
It worked in both ways, in the sense that there isn't, except there's the opera has language, but it's a language that no one concerns about what language it is, or you don't really understand it when they're singing anyway. But music was obviously something. In the world of theater, they tried to send some theater over, but it didn't really work because no one spoke German. And so it was with cinema. They tried to send some cinema over, and that didn't really work. They were much better at taking things, actually. And obviously, the world of art, when they arrived, they already knew about the best Jewish art collections, and they were remarkable collections. And very, very quickly, some of them were hidden, and most of them were eventually found. But people left so quickly, the defeat was so rapid and unexpected that, in fact, you know, a lot of these collections were just waiting to be grabbed. And most of them were taken.
In this picture here?
They were taken to the Jeu de Paume, and there, and the people who would have the pick were Goering and Hitler. Hitler didn't come and see them, but he had agents who would come and pick, and Goering would also pick for Hitler. And so Goering made about 20 visits to the Jeu de Paume and would just go around saying, yes, that one's good, that's good. And they'd be all packed up.
Of the number two, one of the highest ranking German officers, basically shopping in the Jeu de Paume for which art he wants.
Goering was probably the number two in the Nazi regime, the head of the Luftwaffe. The Luftwaffe, for those who had its base in Paris in what is today the Senate, the Luxembourg Palace. And in fact, I say that because it's quite near where I'm talking to you from, very near the Luxembourg Gardens. Anyway, so that's where Goering was. And he wasn't the only one, but the thousands and thousands of works of art, obviously the great works of art. And then the extraordinary thing is that as the occupation continued, the Germans just kept grabbing and grabbing and grabbing from Jewish families. And they would empty out families, they would take the furniture, they would take old furniture, they would take, you know, almost a kitchen sink, and all of that was shipped off. And one of the reasons was that by 42, 43, the war and the East Front was going badly, and people in Germany actually needed things, so bring them over. So the art world. Interestingly, the Germans did not steal the French national collections. So they didn't do what Napoleon had done 150 years ago, earlier. Napoleon came back with lots of great art, particularly from Spain and Italy, and not all of it was returned. But that's Napoleon sleeps quietly in his glory to this day.
But you also had American collectors like Peggy Guggenheim, who were themselves coming in to buy work from local artists and take it out of Paris,
well,
right?
No, Peggy Guggenheim is a special case. She was living in London at the time, but she came over during the phony war when people were leaving. And she was buying, she said in her memoirs, a painting a day. And she had, you know, like Brancusi, if you've seen the Brancusis in her house in Venice, they were bought at that time. In fact, I think, you know, they may even have argued about the price when they were in bed together. It's possible. So this stuff was then, she managed to get most of this stuff out first to Grenoble, where she was staying, and then thanks to Marion Frey, also, well, she could get her own way out, of course. Eventually, she left with most of her collection. And Max Ernst, who was living with Marion Frey at that time in this house, she fell for Max. Everyone fell for Max. He had really beautiful blue eyes. She fell for Max. And basically, she sort of said, well, Max, you're coming with me to New York. He actually was involved with another woman, naturally, because he was so beautiful. And but he still went. And when they got to New York, Peggy said, listen, you're a German. And the only way you'll be safe here is if you marry me. So Max was forced into marry Peggy.
Right.
It didn't last long though, but her collection lasted.
Alan, let's talk about the cinema business, because there are
two areas that people still to this day talk about a golden age, which is in a way slightly embarrassing when you think about it. One is theater, because you did have a lot of theater going on and quite a lot of new writing taking place. And people like Sacha Guitry, who was writing and performing like mad, but Jean Anouilh also, and Girardot, and and even Sartre. Will come to him later, of course. But the movie industry was also extraordinary. It was run in France, as it was in the United States at the time, mainly by Jewish producers. And you'll see this was a big exhibition, anti-Jewish exhibition, the Jewish Peril that was put on in Paris in early 1941. And one of the things they wanted to point out to justify was the Jews, masters of the French cinema. Well, in point of fact, of course, all of those chaps had left. And who were the new masters of French cinema? Were the Germans. And as it happened, Goebbels, who was the information minister and the big brainy controller of everything, he loved cinema. And he sent a man called Alfred Greven to Paris to create his own production company for French movies. And this was called Continental Films. And in general, the good thing about working for Continental Films is you didn't really have any censorship. Obviously, you didn't do anything that was going to upset the Nazis, but you could just get on with it. Everyone else had to see, the script had to be checked, the director had to be checked to make sure there weren't any Jews and there was anything anti-German. But
a lot of movies were made during this period.
220 films were produced in that period. 220 films. And a lot of them were good films, strangely enough. I mean, there were some directors like Marcel Carnet, who was probably best remembered for Les Enfants du Paradis, but he made films, not for Continental Films. Jean Renoir, he left, and some of the others left. Clouseau, who's a great...
What about working in the film industry when you had to get approval from the Germans? Is that considered collaboration?
It's considered working. The thing is that those who worked for Continental Films, for Alfred Greven, were to some extent punished after the war. The strange thing, there was the great French poet and screenwriter Jacques Prévert, who people would meet all the time. And, it wasn't like you wouldn't meet Germans. And Greven, this German, wanted to meet Prévert because he was a great screenwriter. And he said to Prévert, "Why can't I get any good screenplays?" He said, and Prévert said, because the Jews have left. They're the best screenwriters. He said, find me some Jews. So, and so in fact, some French Jewish screenwriters continued working, even for continental films, under a different name. And this was presumed to be known by Greven and the Germans. They needed good films. And in fact, there were good films being made, and it's quite extraordinary that. There was a film, if anyone gets a chance to see it, which caused a big stink at the time, called Le Corbeau, which Corbeau is a raven, a crow. And it's essentially about denunciation. And it's set, in fact, way before the war in a little village where people begin denouncing a doctor as an abortionist. But in fact, it was such a parallel to the denunciations that were taking place in France all the time. People were denouncing each other like mad. It got to a point where the denunciations, not necessarily because you were Jewish or you were in the resistance or you were a communist or anything like that, just because you used to chase my wife or whatever. And it got to the point that anonymous denunciations were arriving at the German headquarters, that they eventually said, we will not open any denunciations that are not signed with a name and an address and some ID, because people were just using anonymous. So this film, Le Corbeau, was about this. And what was interesting was that the resistance, by then we'll come to it in a minute, they had a newspaper, the Cultural Resistance, and they didn't like it, even though it was actually showing, it was a total metaphor for what was happening in France. But they thought it showed France in a bad light.
Alan, there were some French actors who agreed to go to Germany on sort of promotional tours. Can you tell us a little bit about that? I think we have a picture.
Well, see, we've got a picture. In fact, Goebbels was very keen on taking all the artists he could, who were famous, and to take them to Germany on like sort of tours, English, like my circus, my French artist circus.
This is them at a Paris train station about to leave for Germany on one of these tours.
Gare de l'Est, and there you have these are painters who are going to Germany to travel around and look at German museums and meet other German artists. It was all done in a very elegant way. I mean, there was Dorin and Vlaminck and various people who were pretty well known, mainly from the earlier part. And then there's another picture that follows, I think, of movie stars that went. And the second to the left is Danielle Darrieux, who I was very fortunate enough to be able to talk to. She was well into her 90s. Unfortunately, she's now deceased, but she told me about that life very, very, very openly. In fact, the reason she was going, she said, was a film that was opening in Berlin that she'd made. And Greven wanted her to be there because she was such a big star. I mean, she was really, really massive. And she had a boyfriend who was a Dominican, had been the chargé d'affaires from the Dominican Republic in Paris. And when they were lovers, and when the United States declared war, actually when Germany declared war on the United States, the dictator of the Dominican Republic, Trujillo, decided he would also declare war, because that was obviously going to make a big difference to the Allies. So he declared war, and so then all of the diplomats of the Allied countries were plonked in some sort of concentration camp, or at least a diplomatic concentration camp.
But Ellen,
this is a long way of saying that Danielle Darrieux agreed to go only because she could meet her boyfriend in a camp. So it's completely wacky where you have situations.
Did she regret her involvement, though, despite the reason why she went?
Oh, she said, I went to see my boyfriend. I'll go for the opening of this film, and I'll have dinner with Goebbels if I can see my boyfriend. And so she was allowed to do that. And and then in fact he was released later, and she didn't make any more films after that. But the idea of, in her case, it didn't matter, but in quite a number of cases, the fact that people had taken these trips early on, the first were musicians, composers, music critics, conductors. They went for the 150th anniversary of the death or birth or something of Mozart. I recall that they were received by Richard Strauss, no less. I mean, it was done, we intellectuals, we look each other eye to eye. And
the Germans were looking to be taken seriously as cultured people. That was very important for them.
yes, but they couldn't really impose it except in music, because in literature no one could read it. In theater, in cinema, also there's very little. There wasn't much subtitles or doublage. So in fact, it was mainly in music. But they did like to sort of parade the French artists and intellectuals around it, and that was very important. Musicians, writers. They went to Berlin and to Weimar. They were taken to Weimar to bow before the tombstones of Schiller and Goethe. And so everyone was saying, you know, you have your great Molières and Voltaires, we have Schiller and Goethe. Aren't we all clever? Aren't we all the same? So now, the cultural resistance of any consequence began with the writers. And the writers, in the end, when we get to the part of what happens afterwards, you know, the writers are the worst thing. You can say, you know, there were conductors, for example, music conductors. The head of the opéra comique was a well-known communist, and he was in the cultural resistance, but he still continued to perform. So you actually had this ambivalence, these gray areas, and you didn't know quite who was who.
Alan, can I break in and just ask you a more general question? You covered Latin America for many years during the military dictatorships there, and you saw the way that artists and writers and intellectuals responded or had to go into exile. You know, did you see any parallels from Latin America when you were looking at what happened in Paris with the French intellectuals?
There was, I mean, it was probably that inspired me to study this subject also, because I did see how the intellectuals, particularly writers and other artists in Latin America during those years, did play an important role, speaking up for what was happening. But usually they had to do so from abroad. They were in exile, but they still carried an enormous amount of weight. And so the notion that artists who have these privileges because they're well known and they're popular and everyone bows and scrapes before them, they also have responsibilities in times of trouble. And so this is essentially what I was examining, of how the French artists responded, to what extent they lived up to what I considered their responsibility. Now, obviously, the Nazi control system was very, very effective, but it meant that, you know, there was clandestine cultural resistance. Very few artists. There was one, René Char was a poet. He actually took up arms down in the south of France, and he refused to publish anything. But most people wanted to work. I mean, one of the issues that people had to took some explaining is how writers who were writing in a clandestine newspaper horrible things about those who were collaborators, and were doing, you know, or journalists who were pro-Nazis, were writing terrible things under a different name, were themselves publishing books during that regime.
Well, you have Sartre, for example, as you write in your book, and I should have mentioned, which I didn't mention in the book, this is Alan's book, and the show went on, just about everything we're discussing right now. But you write about how Sartre was in the trenches, and he actually, considered joining the resistance, but didn't, but wrote The Draft for Being and Nothingness, this sort of grand existentialist tractate.
Well, no, I don't treat Sartre too gently in the book, simply because he was a prisoner of war, and he was released. He was contacted by some people, say, would you like to, you know, be the leader, because he was already an intellectual figure. And he went down, funnily enough, to see Malraux, who was another great figure from the 1920s and 30s. And Malraux said it's a waste of time being in the resistance until the Americans arrive. So Malraux didn't get very much involved either, and nor did Sartre. The question is about Sartre is that he was, you know, he published Being and Nothingness, his great philosophical thesis. He published and had performed Les Mouches, the Flies, one of the plays. Another one, Huis Clos, I think it's called No Exit in English. And, you know, and these all had to be approved by the Nazis. He was not a very active cultural resistor, shall we say. He didn't write much. He and Simone de Beauvoir spent quite a lot of time, it seemed to me, hanging out, sitting in the Café de Flore, keeping warm, smoking his pipe, or going on holiday. In fact, one of the mischievous things is that after the landings, the Allied landings in June 1944, and before Paris fell in August, or was liberated, Simone de Beauvoir and Sartre went off for a 3-week vacation. So they weren't actually engaged in overthrowing the demon. But someone like Camus, for example.
About Picasso for a moment, because he's also somebody who was in Paris for part of.
Picasso was there we are. Picasso was in a very particular situation because he was obviously Spanish, and he'd been totally opposed to Franco during the Spanish Civil War, and could have been. And he wasn't yet a member of the Communist Party. He became a member of the Communist Party after the war, but he was nonetheless quite clearly a man who, if Franco had said to Hitler, "I want Picasso's head," it would have been an interesting thing. But so Picasso kept a fairly low profile. Now, just before, in the days just in June 1940, around the time of the landings, all these characters, the intellectual elite of shall we say, the resistance of sorts, would have these parties, and this party has taken place, as you can see, in Picasso's studio on the Rue des Grands Augustins. And it's an interesting picture because you have loads of people here sitting down on the bottom looking cross-eyed with a pipe. Is of course Sartre. To his left, talking to the dog, is Camus. Above him is obviously Picasso. To his left is Simone de Beauvoir, and a number of other characters who were well-known writers and intellectuals at that time. And they would have these all-night parties. They were called fiestas. They used the Spanish word. Let's have a fiesta. And they couldn't go out in the middle of the night because of the curfew, so they kept on drinking. So the lines were somewhat blurred, particularly for the privileged class.
Picasso also had a complicated personal life during the war. He had his mistress and his wife in separate hotels, and he was running.
Well, he had two mistresses and a wife, and then during the end of the occupation, Dora Maar was replaced by another mistress, Françoise Gillot, who actually lasted famously for 10 years, which is remarkable. But that took. But the Germans were quite careful about Picasso. They didn't want, they knew he was very famous, and treating him badly. There were enough people around saying, no, let's just, we have enough trouble. And it is said that some of the German officials in charge of the world of art would actually take him wood for his fire to keep him warm and things like that. So he kept a pretty low profile, understandably.
Yeah. And a number of people have asked about Gertrude Stein, the American who was in France during the war. Can you tell us about her level of involvement?
Her level of cultural resistance was minimal. No, Gertrude Stein, she and Alice left Paris and went down to an area quite near Lyon, where they lived in a little village quite quietly, and no one was disrupting them. The good thing is that she had a friend who was had translated some of her works into French, who became the head of the National Library of France. And so she had a protector. This guy was a really raving pro-Nazi, and he in fact sent people to her house to collect and look after her works of art. And she was very anti-communist. And one of the lines, of course, as the occupation went on, is if we are to lose, if the Allies are to win, then communism is going to really win. And so she was quite taken in by that, and she quite believed that. So I can't say that she had a glorious occupation, but she did. Being Jewish, she wasn't troubled. She kept out of the way, had a protector, and kept pretty quiet.
And what about Colette? You write a lot about her in your book.
Well, Colette was so popular in this. I mean, she was just immensely popular. Now, well, then we skip to, well, we can talk about this tragic figure, Colette and Némirovsky, who was also a very well-known writer in the 20s and above all in the 30s, even though subsequently after the war, she was really long forgotten. But she was Jewish, of Russian birth, and came from a wealthy family. And she was like a lot of those wealthy families, they had French governesses. So when she arrived in France, she was fluent in French, and she became a well-known writer.
And a lot of people in the audience would know her book, Suite Française.
Well, Suite Française, when the occupation came, she and her children were in a little village in southern Burgundy, and they basically were just living there, and no one was really bothering them. They were living in a hotel. And in point of fact, her husband, who spoke German, would play billiards with the German officers who were billeted in that hotel. And nothing seemed to be particularly ominous. And she would go off into the countryside. There was a shortage of paper. I don't know if those who have read Suite Française have seen some of the facsimiles of the actual original document. This tiny, tiny letter. She couldn't afford paper, or she couldn't find paper, and she was writing it in this minuscule. Her idea was that she was going to write her 5-volume War and Peace, and of course she only got to write 2, the first 2, Storm in June and Dolce. And it really is based on what she saw at that time in that village. And then when the big roundups occurred in France of Jews, known in Paris as the Veldiv, the Vélodrome d'hiver, but they also happened in other parts. In July 1942, she was denounced. By then the Germans had left that village and had gone off to the East Front. And she was denounced by somebody, and they were just looking for Jews, and they went to pick her up. The remarkable thing is that, and she was taken to Auschwitz, where she actually died of typhoid before they even had a chance to kill her. Her husband also was.
A number of people are asking us, we're just running short on time, about Camus. Can you tell us a little bit about his wartime story?
Yes, Camus was actually a newspaper man in Paris when Paris fell. Well, he left. He went to Lyon for a while and worked in a newspaper there, and then he went back home to Oran in Algeria, which is where he had a wife actually. Camus had been a communist in his youth, and he sort of turned away from that. And he was in Oran and was writing what became known as The Stranger. And no one had really heard of him. And he had some connection through Malraux. And Malraux, he managed, you see, North Africa, Algeria was part of Vichy's rule. And Malraux was in the Vichy area. So there was actually mail. You could send mail to each other. And he sent this book to Malraux, which Malraux thought was amazing. And so he sent it up to Gallimard, and they published it. And he became famous. He then returned to France. And when he returned to France, that's when he joined the resistance. And by the time 44 came in June 44, and after that, he was chief editor of one of the most important clandestine newspapers. And so he had shall we say, he finished up having a very prominent role. But before, in the 20s and 30s, he was not known at all. He was perhaps the one dramatic new name that emerged during that period of the occupation.
And Alan, after the war, there were sort of purge committees looking by type of art. So there was a writers committee, a musicians committee. Can you tell us about these and how they operated?
Had all of these different committees. Part of it was sort of self-serving, because those artists who hadn't actually had a very prominent war thought there's no better way of looking good than to be a member of a purge committee. But also those who had been active created these purge committees. And people who, from in the theatre world, the music world, they were dragged up and they were told to confess, and it was a bit Soviet, and most of them were run by the members of the Communist Party anyway, so it was definitely very Soviet. And if there were serious cases, then people were actually sent up to a higher court, or maybe they'd already been arrested. And the most infamous case probably is of a man called Robert Brasillac, who I think we have a picture of him. Yes, that's him on trial. And he was a novelist of some talent, who became a newspaper editor during the occupation. And among his many, many crimes, I mean, he would denounce people in print and say, if you're looking for Jews, you'll find them there, 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 and there. And if you're looking for resistance people, and all this was in print. I mean, it was just outrageous. But, and then the thing that he was considered like the biggest crime was that when the Veldiv period, around when they were negotiating about how many Jews had to be delivered to Germany, the Germans wanted 100,000, the French said, we can't find 100,000 that quickly, and so on. But Brasillac said, well, take all the children too. That'll get up the numbers. And so the fact that he did that was considered is the worst crime of all. He was tried and shot, but between his trial and the verdict, there was a big movement, strange enough, including a lot of moderate or anti-Nazi writers, intellectuals, who wrote to de Gaulle saying, you know, he shouldn't be shot. It was an opinion. The crime of opinion, something that we should think about today in the New York Times in this debate about Senator Cotton's op-ed piece, the crime of opinion shouldn't be punished in this way in a free country. And of course, there was a big argument between the Camus people who said we must have justice, and another writer, François Mauriac, who said, no, charity, this is the moment for charity. Well, Brasillac was shot. De Gaulle said what I always hoped he would say, in the sense that it suited my thesis. He said, those artists of great talent have special responsibilities. He said that. I read that after I'd actually decided that was the case. But but what is interesting is that you had this period of 45, 46, 47 of trials. A lot of people managed to escape. The most famous one who managed to escape was Céline, who we barely mentioned. Céline, one of the great writers of 20th century France and one of the great anti-Semites of 20th century France. And he managed to escape to Denmark. He was amnestied in the early 50s, as most people were. And by then, of course, the issue was the Cold War, and people were no longer really that intrigued with what had happened before. Let's not look past, we're now, you know, maybe having a war with the Russians or the Soviets or whoever. And so the whole mood made it much more possible to have these amnesties. And the people would say, you know, if you manage to avoid being shot in the first year, then you'd be fine. And that was the main thing. And this quite often happens with revolutions, when the worst period is you grab those first lot, give an example, and then after that you begin to deal with them in a different way. And so, in fact, you know, everyone was back. People who made movies. Arletty, the great French actress, who was in Enfant du Paradis, but she had a Luftwaffe lover and would parade him around, and people got quite upset about that. And she famously was asked, you know, why did you do this? And she said, excuse those who speak French, mon talent est français et mon cul est international. So she therefore justified.
I'll let you translate that, Alan.
Okay, my talent is French, my ass is international. So she, by the early 50s, she was a member of the Cannes Festival jury. So amnesia really set in very well.
Yeah, but we're a bunch of English speakers talking about France, and what's really striking to me as a foreigner here is how revered artists and writers are. You know, you have the great Pantheon with just the writers on the wall buried there. But which is very different from the American context where I'm used to, where writers are respected, but they're not dominating the national conversation. You don't have like anthropologists interviewed on the sort of nightly news. Yeah, so it is a place where there was an expectation of engagement by intellectuals in a way that there might not be in other places.
I think, well, in the case of France, but also in general in Latin countries, we're referring to the Latin Americans, you know, people, very often writers, if they weren't actually opposing some dictatorship, they were being appointed ambassadors by a democratic government or an elected government. And in the case of France, the relationship between intellectuals, artists, and the state has always been close and, shall we say, ambivalent, either supportive or even complicit or in opposition. So you go back to the Voltaire. Voltaire got away, I mean, at different times he had to flee, but he also got away with a great deal. Victor Hugo, well, he also had to flee, but he got away with a great deal. Émile Zola, J'accuse from the Dreyfus Affair, he also had to flee. I mean, you know, you had both things, but there was the expectation. And that expectation continued, interestingly, because enough artists and intellectuals had behaved correctly during the occupation. There was still a space for them after the liberation. They still had people willing to listen to them. And obviously, Sartre had immense influence in the 60s, politically, organizing campaigns against Vietnam, whatever was the campaign going. You know, they were very involved in the fight for Algeria's independence, for example. These were, and to this day, you know, people don't think that they have the same level as they had in the past, but there's a famous French intellectual philosopher, perhaps if you want to call him, Bernard-Henri Lévy. Now, he a lot of people mock him and say, oh, he's, you know, he's just more concerned, you know, how good is my hair and is my shirt white enough? But he was deeply involved in the Bosnian conflict and got François Mitterrand. He took François Mitterrand to Sarajevo. He also was basically responsible for France and then Britain and then the United States getting involved in Libya. Now, that might have been a big mistake against Gaddafi, but whether it was a big mistake or not, I'm saying that he still had the ability to grab a bunch of opposition people from Benghazi, bring them to the Élysée Palace and be received by the president. And so people still, in a sense, look to them in different ways.
Alan, we're going to unfortunately have to wind things up now. We have not gotten to Coco Chanel, unfortunately, and some of the other famous artists and performers that many people would like to talk about. I'm sure Alan would be able to respond to questions, some of your questions privately after this. We'll definitely post a recording of this event. And it's just been really, thank you, Alan. It's been really inspiring to talk to you, especially now at a moment when there is so much turmoil and suffering in the United States and around the world. So thank you so much for giving us a sort of blueprint for maybe how some of us could do more and be more engaged with
well, I think just a very last word. I mean, one of the things in Latin America that I would ask myself, although in the position as a journalist, I had a little bit of clout, but in this situation, I ask myself all the time, what would I have done? Would I have been courageous? Would I have fled? Would I have just been shut my mouth? Should I have waited until things were looking good, then join the wave? And that's what.
Do you feel like this is a moment now when we're all being tested in the same way?
Well, I think, different times people have to, it may not be quite as orderly in a strange way when you have a very clear situation. It's almost like a huis clos that you had with the occupation. But I think that everyone, without sounding too pompous, we all have responsibilities in different ways and we do what we can.
Yeah. Well, thank you for all the work that you do in Senegal, and thank you for being a wonderful man around town in Paris. I love having you here. And thank you to everyone here for joining us, for all the members of the Alliance Française who are here. We loved having you, and thank you for being so active on the chat. Please do sign up for our newsletter. You can click on the link that our chat master Leo will put on the chat, or just send us an email to pandemoniumu2021@gmail.com. Thank you for the Federation of the Alliance Française USA for sponsoring this event today. We will have another event sponsored by them, the 5th in our series, Friday week, with the sociologist Claude Fischler and Guillemette Farr, the columnist for Le Monde, talking about French and American food rules, misunderstandings at the table. And on Wednesday, in a few days' time, we'll have Gary Slutkin, the physician who now runs an NGO that cures violence the same way that people cure infectious diseases. So he'll have some very interesting perspectives on the violence that's starting in America now and whether it's the start of a pandemic, unfortunately, of violence, and how we can stop it if it is. Thank you to everyone again for being here. And we have a tradition at the end of every PANU session to unmute everyone and let everyone say a big hello from wherever they are.